from the bubbly part of Abuja, which is not the economic nerve center of Nigeria, but the power capital of the over 200 million populated country. Welcome to Global Business. I am Imewari Uhiamokai. Today on the program, I told you last week that we'll be looking at energy sector, oil and gas in the Niger Delta to be precise. And our guest is Charles Majomi, an energy consultant of Trajan Energy Limited. He'll be looking at corruption and conflict in the Niger Delta as it concerns relationship between investors, host communities, and of course government. We'll be looking at that on our talking point. This is minus the other issues that we have to tackle on this program. So sit back as usual, relax, learn, and of course you can join us through our social media platforms, all social media, Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook. Of course, you can also send us an email on globalbusiness@gmail.com, globalbusiness on AIT@gmail.com. Welcome again. Let's get the program rolling.
From the 1950s, when oil was discovered in commercial quantities, the production capacity of oil and gas in Nigeria has grown in leaps and bounds, making it one of the largest oil producers in Africa and the world. This has no doubt enhanced the economic growth and development of Nigeria and has raised the living standards of its citizens. Nigeria's oil and gas resources are located in a region of the country known as the Niger Delta, a very densely populated region that extends over about 70,000 square kilometers of land, comprising 7.5% of Nigeria's total land mass. Despite the enormous energy reserves of the Niger Delta, the people remain poor, marginalized, and restive. This has led to conflicts and the loss of lives and huge investments. Insurgent militant groups such as MEND frequently engage in face-offs with the Nigerian government, resulting in frequent paralysis of the oil and gas sector and a considerable revenue loss for the nation. Sadly, the negative effects of this frequent unrest in the petroleum-rich Niger Delta region is evident in the increasing dearth to investments in that section of the country and the heartbreaking condition of its people. Have you often wondered, like me, how it is that the Niger Delta region of Nigeria, despite being home to one of the world's greatest reserves of crude oil and natural gas reserves, remains underdeveloped, impoverished, and ridden with conflicts that destroy investor confidence? In other parts of the world, similarly blessed with such abundance, places like Houston in the United States, Point Lissus in Trinidad or Yambu, a thriving city built on the desert sands of Saudi Arabia, such resources have succeeded in radically transforming the economic well-being of the communities that host them, improving the quality of services like education and healthcare, building vital road and transportation infrastructure, and attracting the attention of global investors. However, this is not the case in Nigeria. The paradox begs for answers to explain what is happening that makes exactly the reverse true in Nigeria. One wonders who is responsible and what might be done to reverse this potentially catastrophic situation.
Hello, welcome to Talking Points on Global Business. Like I told you earlier on the program, we're looking at the issue of corruption, how corruption fuels conflict in the Niger Delta. Like you know, about 30% of Nigeria's rich reserves and resources is offshore, and offshore is Niger Delta. Niger Delta contains so much oil, and that is what also that's what drives the Nigerian economy, because about 80 to 90% of revenue is from crude. That's it. So we're looking at what is disturbing investments in the Niger Delta, what is fueling conflicts. Just recently, a new Niger Delta group came up to say that every oil company should leave the Niger Delta before May 29th, 2019. And I ask myself, why? But there are issues in the Niger Delta that we'll be looking at today on the program. And I've got someone who's an energy consultant, the CEO of Trajan Energy Company, Charles Majami. Thank you for joining us on the program.
You're welcome.
Okay, so Charles, when they started the amnesty program in 2015, the Jonathan administration, actually, Yar'Adua administration started it and Jonathan administration continued it. After the amnesty program, we thought all was well in the Niger Delta. But there still seems to be conflict, because recently, like I said earlier on, a group is saying all oil companies must vacate. Why is this conflict unending?
I think the conflict is unending because there is no real solution being offered currently to employ the youths of these communities, to give them hope that there is a better future, and that future is tied to their inheritance, or the legacy of revenue wealth that in part should be owed to them.
Okay, now you say the youths are not, who is not giving them this opportunity? When you say they are not given the opportunity, or they are not allowed to flourish?
Well, let me say this. You've been to the Niger Delta. I know we've discussed this in the past. And if you go there, you will see that the appearance of the place is simply not commensurate with the kind of wealth that comes from there. Okay? So as a result, you have the potential there for a great deal of restiveness, angry youths who are naturally entitled to their anger because of the lack of benefits that have accrued them, the environmental degradation that has happened and is currently happening, that is destroying livelihoods, the lack of reintegration training. Okay, so when you displace somebody's livelihood, the hope is that whoever is coming to do that, whether be it an amnesty program, will go a step further than just giving money to a bunch of guys to stay in hotels and such, and transit to real training programs that allow those youths to integrate themselves into the new value chains of economic value chains that will be created as a result of the economic activities being contemplated there that currently are not taking place because of violence and restiveness.
Okay, now let's stop looking at probably the results. You know, when they talk about, when a doctor, the patient goes to see a doctor, the doctor says, what are your symptoms? And the doctor uses the symptoms to look at the root cause of that. Let's go to the root cause. In your own view, you have worked in the Niger Delta and you've worked outside this country. In your own view, what is the cause of all this?
First of all, let me say that community agitation around investments in extractives is not particular to Nigeria. In any country, in most countries where large-scale investments have been contemplated, where communities will be impacted, there's always been this sensitivity around what is going to happen to the community as a result of the activities that are required to lead to significant investment in those communities. The common element with all these countries, though, is the non-inclusion and the sense of non-inclusiveness of the community in the activities taking place around the investment. And typically what has happened is you find that the kind of non-inclusion has created youth restiveness, a sense of being abandoned, which has marginalized the investors from the communities themselves. And that distance, that marginalization that has occurred between the investment community that wish to do this investment, often in partnership with the government, and the community themselves, usually the youth of the community, has created the potential for third parties, who we call conflict entrepreneurs, to come in and make the division between those two elements, the investors and the youth, larger. And usually these people instrumentalize violence for their own personal gain, having seen that there is this potential for distance between the investor, their intentions, and the needs of the youth of the community.
In fact, I'm interested in that phrase, or would I call it a word you called conflict entrepreneurs. Who is a conflict entrepreneur? You call them the third parties. Who is a conflict entrepreneur?
Well, I mean, an entrepreneur is someone in general who sees an opportunity to make a quick benefit for himself, whether it's financial or otherwise. That's what you call an entrepreneur in commercial terms. We have seen that this same principle of an individual benefiting from an existing situation commercially has now come into the Nigerian development space when it comes to extractive industries in these particular communities. So whether we call them warlords or conflict entrepreneurs or militant leaders, these types of individuals are emerging in the space between communities and investors, and they are creating value for themselves, either through extorting money from the state or from the investors, or by creating violence in areas where big-scale investments are being contemplated, in order to cover up their own ongoing illicit activities in these areas, such as smuggling, gun running, bunkering, and all of these types of activities. So it is important to understand that these characters have emerged in the Nigerian extractive space when it comes to developing projects onshore in oil and gas. And we must do something to mitigate against the kind of chaos that they cause, not only for the communities, but for the nation as a whole. Because you have to understand that the jobs that we need to create for the future of this country are really, the low-hanging fruits with respect to jobs are around adding value to our energy resources, particularly gas, which has a very vibrant and long value chain that gives employment at every level. And unless we're able to properly deal with the host communities in a manner that brings inclusiveness, that gives them rights to derive some benefits from the resources and the investments being made. These conflict entrepreneurs will always emerge, and they emerge primarily to disrupt these activities for their own narrow, selfish interests. And again, they do it by instrumentalizing violence, by targeting the elements of a community that would be most affected and restive by these types of investments being made and them not being included in them.
Is there corruption in this whole chain you have just painted?
Absolutely. I mean, the corruption is an inherent part of conflict, given the fact that you are using, the conflict is often a cover for corrupt enrichment that is ongoing. It is a means of state capture, effecting state capture, whereby a group of people, or a gangster, or a warlord, or whatever you might call him, seeks to derive the short-term benefit of being paid extortion money for effectively allowing the project to go through, over allowing peace to reign so that the community as a whole can benefit from that investment.
Okay, you've talked about the fact that something needs to be done. Who needs to do what for us to begin to attack this issue from its roots?
Well, let me first of all say that why we need to do it. I mean, a lot of people say that investors should really be just concerned with investment. Why should they bother with host communities when really it's the government's responsibility, especially if you're a foreign investor coming into a foreign land? You would expect that the go-to person or the go-to group for that type of community engagement would be the government. Sadly, what we've seen is a lot of collusion between government officials and instrumentalizers of violence, conflict entrepreneurs, who, and doesn't happen every time, but who have in the past colluded to drive conflict in order to elicit illegal rent.
So you're talking of a collaboration now?
Yes, and I think that's
a strong allegation. I mean, it means that you are saying government officials are involved in this whole power play or in this whole play that leads to violence.
I think in some instances, it's certainly the case, and it's on record that it's actually happened. Again, I'm not saying that it happens every time, but it's a disturbing development. And the other thing we're seeing too is we're seeing that those groups of people, those youths mostly who are instrumental, who are basically the operatives, instrumentalized to drive violence by a conflict entrepreneur, are actually rising politically and being rewarded by virtue of their allegiance to certain conflict entrepreneurial factions. And because there's so much wealth within these enclaves of conflict entrepreneurialism, they are promoted politically within their state. So a militant can theoretically rise to become a member of the state National Assembly. And when you get there, you can now understand how much more deadly this collaboration and you can also and how this collaboration can take place. So typically, somebody who might be in the National Assembly will still work with his former boss who had promoted him, who may still be an illegal gun smuggler or a bunkerer or someone who engages in extorting good projects for money.
Okay, you are going to the point of what should be done. You have looked at why it should be done. So what should be done and who should do what?
Again, we're not reinventing the wheel in making suggestions regarding what should be done. At the heart of whatever is done must be a very, very solid plan to engage the right elements in the community. So you must, first of all, engage the right leadership in the community, understand the intra-community dynamics. How do factions within the community relate to one another? How do the youth relate to women's groups? How do cult groups relate to religious groups? How does the military element, the security element within the community relate with the leadership of the community? Are there multiple potential leaders of the community? At what point is it likely that a conflict entrepreneur might come in? Now, this sounds like a lot of work to do for an investor, but what we have come up with is a tool that a visiting investor who wishes to gauge whether or not a community is ready for the kind of investment he's bringing can use. And this tool does what I've just described as a primary activity, which is to basically...
Thank you very much, Charles, for talking to us on Talking Point Global Business. We've been looking at the issues in the Niger Delta. And in fact, now you know that they are deep and not just what we hear on radio or see on TV. They are deeper. We hope that the Nigerian government will really engage the civil society groups and do something about engaging communities in the Niger Delta. That's Talking Point for today on Global Business. The program continues. Well, with the background report for that interview on Talking Point, and of course the interview, I'm sure you have a better understanding of issues in the Niger Delta. Of course, corruption and conflict must not be allowed to spoil or destroy a place that is producing about 70% of Nigeria's revenue. Offshore, 70% of Nigeria's revenue is offshore, and the Niger Delta is the home ground of that offshore. You must join me to speak out. You must join me to take action, and government must take action and come against conflict entrepreneurs in the Niger Delta. Do not pretend that they are not there. They are there. They exist. But we must try to minimize their influence in communities. That's Global Business this Monday. Join us again next week. I am Imewaro Hyomokai. Doing business with you is good business for me. So you know why I always love doing business with you.